As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
So Ukrainian Defense Minister Alexei Reznikov told Financial Times in an interview published Wednesday that his country serves as an ideal testing ground for Western weaponry. So Reznikov said that Ukraine's Western backers can see how their weapons work in a war against Russia to see if they're efficient or need upgrades. Reznikov said, quote, "For the military industry of the world, you can't invent a better testing ground," end quote. So Reznikov has actually said this before. Last year when he was asking for the U.S. and its NATO allies to send more weapons, he said, quote, "We are interested in testing modern systems in the fight against the enemy, and we are inviting arms manufacturers to test the new products here," end quote. So the International Atomic Energy Agency, that is the UN's nuclear watchdog, the IAEA, said on Wednesday that its inspectors have seen no explosives at the Russian-controlled Zaporozhye nuclear power plant in Ukraine, despite claims from Kiev that Russia had planted bombs. According to an IAEA press release, Director General Rafael Grossi said that the agency's experts have, quote, "in recent days and weeks inspected parts of the facility, including some sections of the perimeter of the large cooling pond, and have also conducted regular walkdowns across the site, so far without observing any visible indications of mines or explosives," end quote. So Zelensky claimed on Tuesday that Russia planted explosives at this power plant, and that's something Ukrainian officials have been claiming for a few weeks now. And they're saying that, an attack, Russia could sabotage the plant very soon, saying kind of like it's an imminent thing, and claiming that Russia would try to make the damage look like Ukrainian shelling. And then you have Russian officials now accusing Ukraine of plotting to blow up the facility using a dirty bomb, using missiles, as opposed to explosives or anything like that. Again, the plant is Russian controlled. It's a very important thing to understand here, because it doesn't make much sense for Russia to blow up a nuclear power plant that it controls. So the Kremlin said Wednesday that the risk of Ukraine carrying out sabotage attacks at the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant was really high. And so the plant is located, again, in the Zaporozhye Oblast on the Dnieper River, on the south bank of the Dnieper River. Ukraine controls the territory to the north. And another thing, always important to point out, if you remember last fall, this plant was being shelled a lot in the town around it and areas near it. And Ukraine was blaming Russia the whole time, saying that it was Russia doing it. And of course, Russia was saying it was Ukraine. And again, the key context here is that Russia controls the plant. They have since March 2022. And then we later learned, Russia was saying that Ukraine was launching these cross river attacks, trying to retake the plant. And then a few months later, there was a report in the Times of London that said, Ukraine did in fact launch an attack on the plant, try to cross the river, and it was supported by the U.S. because they used the HIMARS rocket systems. And a Pentagon official said that they provided real-time intelligence during this assault. So the Chinese Defense Ministry on Wednesday said the U.S. was turning Taiwan into a powder keg in a warning over the Biden administration approving new arms deals for Taiwan worth $440 million. So Colonel Tan Kefi, he's the spokesman for the Chinese Defense Ministry, reiterated that China is firmly opposed to U.S. arms sales to Taiwan. So Tan said, quote, "We urge the U.S. side to abide by the One China principle and the three China-U.S. joint communiques, immediately cease arms sales to Taiwan, stop any form of military collusion with Taiwan, earnestly fulfill its commitment to not support Taiwan independence, and stop going further down the road and dangerous path," end quote. So the U.S. agreed to sever formal diplomatic and military ties with Taiwan as part of its normalization agreement with China. And that was formalized in 1979, and they had two communiques then. And then in 1982, they issued a third joint communique regarding U.S. arms sales to Taiwan. Congressional leaders in both parties have warned the White House that the law which legalizes this unconstitutional surveillance of American citizens, Section 207, which was enacted in 2008, they're saying it will not be renewed absent significant changes. For instance, such reforms would prohibit federal agents from obtaining phone, email, and other electronic communication records of Americans interfacing with targeted foreign individuals. Rep. Jim Jordan, Republican from Ohio, he said, quote, "There's no way we're going to be for reauthorizing that in its current form. No possible way. We're concerned about surveillance, period," end quote. Congress granted the spy agencies this authority by creating Section 702 of the FISA Amendments Act in 2008. Since then, it's been renewed twice with strong Republican backing. But for years, this law has faced opposition from Democrats over similar conservative concerns that, the concerns that the conservatives have now, that it grossly violates American civil liberty. So hopefully this means that they won't be able to renew it, or at least they'll reform it. Hopefully they don't renew it at all. But Matt Gaetz said, quote, "You couldn't waterboard me into voting to reauthorize 702. These 702 authorities were abused against people in Washington on January 6th, and they were abused against people who were affiliated with the BLM movement, and I'm equally aggrieved by both of those things," end quote. So saying that they've been abused to go after people on both sides of the political spectrum. But Gaetz did support the program's reauthorization 5 years ago. People are returning, they're burying their dead and inspecting the destruction left by Israel's aggression. So thousands of people were displaced, and now they're starting to return home, and a lot of people are finding that their homes were destroyed. And the death toll right now is 12 people, and at least 120 others were wounded, including 20 in critical condition. So I guess that means the death toll could rise. And the Israeli army said that one of their soldiers was killed in the assault. And one thing that is interesting is that they had funerals, and Palestinian Authority officials, went down there and they kind of drove them out of there. They're not happy with the Palestinian Authority. They see them as kind of collaborators with the Israeli occupation forces. So very rough situation for the people living there. And we're probably going to see something like this happen again soon.
Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
What he'll do is he'll go through and tell you, question by question, what kinds of pieces of information about American history Americans are completely confused about.
Right.
When you quiz them. And it's things like they can't put the Civil War and the War for American Independence and maybe one other thing even in chronological order. Now, if you can't even put those in order, then you don't understand anything. And we're talking about American adults being polled. These are people who, by and large, went through the official course of instruction. And what they have is a hodgepodge of absolute meaningless bits of nothingness.
Right. Well, I'll put my tinfoil hat on for a minute, Tom. I think that's intentional. I think those in power ultimately don't want a knowledgeable citizenry, right? Because if they understand the mistakes of the past, then they'll better be on guard to make sure they don't happen in the future. The best way for authoritarians to get away with all their shenanigans is to dumb down the population. So they're distracted. They lack context, as you point out. They might be bombarded with content, all these factoids that in school they have to memorize and regurgitate for the test. So there's no shortage of content, but they're deprived of context. And so what that leads to, what you were referencing with the statistic that just came out a few weeks ago from the NAEP score, what's called the Nations Report Card, where they aggregate all the assessments in all the public schools, and they're kind of measuring, English and math and history for all the kids. And the recent result that came out was that for 8th graders across the whole country, only 13% of 8th graders in American public schools are proficient in American history. 13%. These are future voters. These are future elected officials. These are people who are going to have the reins of power in our kind of constitutional republic, such as it remains today. But the problem, as you point out, applies to adults as well, right? Like only 51% of adults can even name all three branches of the federal government. A majority of Americans fail a U.S. citizenship test that immigrants have to take when they're applying for citizenship. So we have this widespread problem. Gore Vidal once called us, as a result of all this, the United States of amnesia.
What's interesting is that didn't really happen until a book called Shays' Rebellion, The American Revolution's Final Battle, which is a book by Leonard Richards, came out in 2003. Rothbard is writing in the 1970s, and he already smelled a rat in the official version of Shays' Rebellion, and he was vindicated in this book. But the point is, you have a little box in this book, in your America's History book, in which you say that Shays' Rebellion was portrayed propagandistically to the public and then used as justification for why we need a strong central government in order to put down things like this. And then a connection is made to today, or roughly today, saying these kinds of things called false flags, we see quite a bit throughout history. So for example, and then you give the example of in 1990, well, why should I tell the story? What's the example from 1990?
So this is the young girl, Naira. This young woman was testifying to a congressional committee. She was from Kuwait, country in the Middle East, and she told through tears these senators that she had witnessed soldiers in Iraq taking newborn babies out of their incubators and leaving them to die. So everyone gets outraged, and here's this credible testimony from this girl, and she was a witness, and all these senators, the resolution to go to war passed, I think it was by 5 votes in the Senate when they later passed it, and 7 senators all cited Naira's testimony as very influential in their reasoning why we need to go to war, right, against Saddam. And so, as it turns out, it was completely false. This girl was the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador. She was coached by an advertising agency who had $1 million plus contract to find a way to induce America into war against Iraq because that would benefit Kuwait. So yeah, we put this in the book and so many other examples like this because this stuff didn't just happen 250 years ago. As you point out, the propaganda around Shays' Rebellion and the real reasons behind it are far more interesting, and it's that way with modern examples as well.
Talk a lot about the founders, whether you're talking with a person from the right or the left. they're always going to have this reverence for the founders and the Constitution. Well, it turns out our favorite revolutionaries, Patrick Henry, Thomas Jefferson, Sam Adams, they were actually against the creation of a national government. And at the same time, we're saying the founders. And then the Alexander Hamiltons, they called themselves the Federalists when they were actually against the Federation. They wanted total nationalization. So these are like these nuances that we really want to bring back up so that we can actually have deeper discussions in our nation about what we're trying to get at. Because if you just go Constitution, 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 Hillary Clinton's saying Constitution, we're all saying Constitution. We need to understand these details about what we actually are wanting to do. What are our real goals? What do you really want? What do you really believe in? Yeah, I think that's just what we're trying to do with these books in general, is just open back those discussions that haven't really been had for 100 years or more.
Tom, when I was in high school, I remember reading, or being required to read, I should say, the Federalist Papers. Very common practice, right? Very common assignment given to high school kids in civics class or whatever. And at no point was I ever told that such a thing called the Anti-Federalist Papers ever existed. It was, I think I was like a college senior or something. I stumbled across it online. I was like, what is this? And so for us, with Elijah and I, how we're approaching this is really just trying to plant a lot of seeds for alternative perspectives, because the victors always write the history in a way that flatters them and reinforces their narrative. And so, of course, the people who favored adoption of this central government are going to cast history in a way that portrays that as the inevitable conclusion of the progress of Americana, and how dare we question anything else but this inevitability. We want to spark some conversation in families and say, is that true? How might they have improved the Articles of Confederation? How could they have preserved and tweaked them in a way that would, maybe make them a little more, quote unquote, functional to the agreement of the critics, but still preserve that core Confederate power of preserving state sovereignty?
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
So as we're saying, and we'll continue to say, you're not going to see a crash coming now. In the Northern Hemisphere, it's summertime and the living is easy. You spread your wings and you make for the sky. So it's going to start happening in late September, October. The reality is going to set in. The tourist business is booming in Europe. And a number of these countries, 10, 15, 20% of their economy comes from tourism. So it's going to be an artificial boost. And as we write in your Trends Journal, the ECB is very adamant about continuing to raise interest rates. Look, you're going to raise interest rates as a place like Germany is already in recession. And you're looking at your PMI numbers, your manufacturing numbers, one after another. They're all in negative territory. So consumer spending is going up, but not manufacturing. You ready? More than a third of non-financial U.S. businesses are in distress. Investment banking fees plunge. More on the office building bust. Oh, that place called Portland, Libtard land up there? Yep. The largest city in Oregon. Population escaping. Crime, violence, thanks to the COVID war that nobody talks about. What else? Asian junk bond defaults. Set a record. Don't worry, everything's going to be fine. Everything will be fine. Vote for me. Vote for Mr. Boogie. I'll put rhythm in the White House and all the squares have got to go. Okay. And then, of course, when the economy fails, jobs go with it. Our 45th week of this. Markets see $1 trillion less in merger and acquisition activities than last year. We warned this was going to happen. Again, let's go back and put all this into perspective. To fight the COVID war, they dumped in countless trillions of dollars to the people. Stay home, here's money, don't go to work. Yay, free money, zero interest rate policy. The bigs could get bigger. That game is over. A lot more.
You run your mouth and I run my business, brother. You tell everybody I'm busted. You talk so much you got me disgusted. But you run your mouth and I run my business, brother.
Will an accidental nuclear explosion in Ukraine wipe out the accidental biolabs? Juicy developments out in the Ukraine. It's amazing how much Russian infrastructure the Russians are looking to sabotage. First, they decided, hey, instead of selling oil and natural gas, or more accurately, instead of selling natural gas to Germany, we could just blow up our own pipeline. We could just do that. And instead of having a dam here, and cities in the areas that we've already conquered, we could flood them. We could do that. And instead of not having a nuclear explosion, we could have a nuclear explosion. I mean, these Russians are really going off the rails. whatever they can get their hands on and blow up of their own infrastructure. It's like the way that we enjoy fireworks. That's the way the Russians celebrate their independence, is they look at the infrastructure that they've already conquered and they go, how can we make this thing explode? I just wonder from a forward-looking standpoint. You know, we're over here and we're a bunch of dumb hippies just looking for countries to get along and for everyone to have freedom, wealth, and prosperity. A very simple message that sometimes gets lost in these convoluted rambles. But you look at what's going on, Russia, Ukraine, us going, NATO's coming all the way up to your doorstep, and it's not an option for us not to be all the way up to your doorstep. Putin going, hey, that's my red line. Biden going, I don't care what color line it is. I don't even see colors anymore. That's what our whole leftist movement's all about. So that's it. I'm going in there. And so Biden, he goes, you know, they push. Things escalate. You make sure that we don't walk away with no peace deals. And now we're already at the point that, not that a nuclear bomb, but there might end up with a nuclear explosion. Doesn't sound like this is going in the right direction. And then I was also just wondering, because I've heard about how good the soil is out in the Ukraines. Apparently these people, they got the best soil on the whole world. Apparently that's why you got all this bread coming out of the Ukraines, is because that soil is juicy. That's the juiciest soil on God-given earth. I wonder if, would a nuclear explosion permanently ruin the soil of, well, I guess isn't Chernobyl out there and they still grow stuff? How does that work? Is Chernobyl in Ukraine or is it somewhere else in Russia? CIA Chief William Burns called to reassure Kremlin after Wagner mutiny. So read the first paragraph. This is from the Wall Street Journal. Washington, CIA Director William Burns quietly reached out to his Russian counterpart in the aftermath of a failed mutiny by the Wagner Group. Leader Yevgeny delivered a message that the U.S. had no involvement in Russia's internal chaos, officials familiar with the matter said. Because when two countries are not going to fight each other, but they are going to be at war with each other, but without actually fighting each other, they have to let each other know that they're still playing by some rules. And you know what the rules are? Is that you can't go fuck up the oligarch shit. You know, it's like, listen, we're going to continue to fight each other, but of course I wouldn't actually try and come for your position. I understand that when this war and whole thing's over, you're going to need to continue to be in charge and be able to continue to make your money, just like I want to continue to be in charge and continue to make my money. And so there are rules to this, which is the oligarchs can't go after the other oligarchs. It's like if you were playing chess and the two queens were in cahoots, we're like, listen, we're not going to attack each other here. At the end of the game, we both still want to be on the board making all the money off the pawns. And so that's the way, I mean, how offensive is this that the CIA chief calls him up to go, listen, we're at war with you guys without being at war with you guys. And we're going to try and, you know, keep this thing going as long as possible so that as many Ukrainians as possible sacrifice their lives for you guys to have less resources at the end of this. But at the end of the day, I want your position to be safe because this is a fair fight here. I'm not coming for your job. I mean, sure, the young men in Ukraine, as many of those people that need to die to try and make Russia have less money, of course, we're going to continue to do that. Yeah, we're going to continue to send them resources and continue to fight you guys, but, you know, it's just going to be the young men that die. I'm not going to challenge your position. I wasn't going to challenge your position. So, listen, it's being reported by the news. You don't have to be worried about this thing escalating because the oligarchs, they all know that they're safe. They're not really fighting with each other. Remember, they're just playing a game. They're just playing a game, and the chess pieces are just the human lives of the younger men. So don't worry, this isn't escalating. There was an interesting court opinion that was handed down last week from the Supreme Court. So I remember a couple years ago, you had that gay cake. You had some baker, they go in, and they go, hey, I want a cake, and I want nothing but men painted on the top of this. I want celebration of Dan and Mike. And the guy's like, I'm a Christian. Do you mind going to a different baker? And he goes, no, you're going to make me this cake. And the whole thing made no sense to me because if a guy doesn't want to make you a cake, you really want him making you a cake? You think that's going to taste like a good cake? You think the guy's going to do a nice job with it? And if you own a store and you don't want to make a cake for someone, no soup for you. Isn't that part of owning a business that you can go, listen, I don't want to have to serve you for whatever reason. But if you're a religious individual and you don't want to make a cake for someone, doesn't it make more sense? Firstly, a cake is not like a necessity for life. It's not water to your house. It's not like, hey, I provide water to this area and I don't like you, so I'm not going to provide water to your house. This is an item that doesn't need to exist. You don't need to have cake. And even if you did need to have cake, this isn't the only person that you can get cake from. So firstly, why do you want cake from the person that doesn't want to make you a cake, right? And secondly, why should the person be forced to make you the cake? Should have looked that one up because I seem to remember that the court decided for the gay couple and not the baker. But similar court case this time around where a lady makes websites, gay couple, they want a really gay website. It's the Grindr Express Wedding Spectacular. I met Mike on this app and you can meet your lover too. Orgies on the second floor. I don't know that any of this was being included, but conceptually, if you're going to force someone to engage in labor that they don't want to engage in, that they can't pick their own clientele for whatever reason. Now, in my own opinion, I think the way liberty should work is you really shouldn't be forced to do anything. So if I own a business and I don't want to let someone in my business, I don't want to let someone on my property, Why am I going to force somebody? And I think the market punishes you for that. I think if you went to New York City and someone put up a big old sign in the front of their store that said no Jews allowed, you probably wouldn't see a ton of people at that business. And you know what? I would rather know that. Oh, this guy doesn't want my business. I'll go spend my money somewhere else. Isn't that almost the better way to approach things? That guy doesn't want me here. I'll go spend my money somewhere else. You don't think the market can reward? And like, do we really think we're going to live in a world where if bigots say, hey, I don't want to serve whoever here, that's going to be enriched in the market and that other people are going to be left without any place that they can go for goods and services? I don't think that's the state of the world that we live in. I guess I got more confidence in the goodness of mankind and the power of free markets of just exchanging things for dollars than our overlords do.
Well, you know, Teddy Roosevelt is credited with the old saying, speak softly and carry a big stick, which I always thought was kind of good advice. You know, don't be so bellicose. Well, the opposite is now obviously the case with the UK. Speaking as loudly as they can, being as bellicose as they can, egging Ukraine onto war, acting tough like they're going to go ahead and go to war with Russia as well. Turns out they don't have a big stick at all. And in fact, as you point out, as we saw in the Daily Mail, they don't have any sticks at all, hardly. They only have 40 tanks that are ready to go to war. They've already given 14 to Ukraine, and they were promptly blown up. So those are gone. But they're bellicose. We know Boris Johnson. We know from the former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett that there was a deal. There was a deal signed, at least initialed, between Russia and Ukraine very early in the war, which would have ended the fighting right there. And big Boris Johnson, carrying that small stick with a big mouth, he said, no way, you guys cannot make peace. You got to keep fighting. And that's what happened. So Russia is estimated to have 2,000 tanks. And here comes little old UK with 40 tanks rolling in. I don't know. It doesn't sound like a very even fight.
Let's go get them. Let's go get them.
Yeah, you and him fight. Yeah, that's what.
And who will be the victims? The young people who hardly pay enough attention to stop it.
The whole thing came out in the British Parliament. Admiral Sir Tony Vatican, he's the chief of the defense staff. He's the head of the military in the UK. Now, he went before Parliament, was giving a little update. And he says, at the Commons, that's their House of Parliament, Commons Defense Ministry yesterday, his claim that Britain could provide a division, which is around 17,500 fully equipped troops, accompanied by vehicles and artillery, that they could provide just one division was dismissed as a fantasy. So they can't even field one division of troops. This is just a random search this morning that I found out. Now, this is from an article that came out recently. Germany is running out of explosive artillery shells, having provided it in bulk to Kiev. So this is from June 20th of 2023. They gave all their artillery shells to Kiev, and they don't have any left. So they're not looking in good shape. And this next one again, this is Germany again. This is from The Economist. I don't have the exact date, but it's important. This is the chief of the German army, Alphonse Mayes. He said, the Bundeswehr, the army that I'm allowed to lead, is more or less depleted. He says, we saw it all coming and we're not able to get through with our arguments and draw implement conclusions, etc., etc. It says, almost a year after the general's much noted post, Germany's armed forces are more depleted than ever, owing to the kit they are sending to Ukraine. And this is the operative quote here from the Economist article. Their stockpile of ammunition would last only a few days.
If I had to pick one group of people who probably are the most responsible for this episode over there, which is going so badly, would be NATO.
Yeah.
Without the existence of NATO, we wouldn't be having this discussion. There may be a lot more trade going on between Germany and Russia. Who knows what would happen? But it can't be more chaotic than it is now. And this is something that nobody wants to realize, and they refuse to talk it over. That's why the voice from RFK is at least worthwhile listening to, because he doesn't think we have to do this. And all the way back to Taft, after the war, he didn't even think it was a good idea.
Yeah.
But they think this is so necessary. It's it's an illusion as far as I'm concerned of what they're doing, but it may be what we hint all the time. Maybe it is about military dollars.
Yeah.
And that to me is the most criminal thing. Being dumb, you can excuse a couple dumb people for starting wars, but the ones who do it on purpose because they know we're going to build more bombs. Right now, there's somebody sitting back there and say, let's start a business.
Yeah. Good money.
Let's build more bombs.
Yeah.
But the limitation will be the bankruptcy. And therefore, I hope our country wises up and decides that our borders are more important than the borders of our empire.
But there's such a heavy shroud of propaganda that sort of settled over the American people, and indeed in NATO as well. I was on a radio show earlier today discussing the release on Friday before a holiday weekend of the State Department's assessment of what they did wrong in the Afghanistan evacuation. And it was just very typical, because one of the main things, essentially, if you boil it down, is we kind of basically believed our own propaganda, that the Afghan government would stay in power, no chance that the Taliban would take over, it would take months and we'd be able to get out and everything. So they believed all the lies. And one of the things that I pointed out in this is that they talk about lessons learned. They haven't learned no lessons at all, because they're doing the same thing here. And it's not us saying that Russia is great. It's saying that if you're facing such a formidable force and you really don't have any tanks, you might want to just look for a different solution, back down a little. And here's a funny example I was just going to put up, if you don't mind, Dr. Paul. This is a small example. Put that next one up. This is a small example from Moon of Alabama. This is a fraction of all the articles talking about Russia running out of missiles, Russia running out of missiles. And it's all from the mainstream media, Daily Mail, Mirror, Express, Financial Times, over and over. You can see dozens and dozens. Well, CSIS, which is really the military-industrial complex top think tank in D.C., they came out with a report this week finally admitting the truth beyond all this propaganda. If we can put this up, CSIS report, Russia isn't going to run out of missiles, after telling us for months that they were running out. So this, I just think, is the danger, regardless of your position on the war, the huge danger of believing this propaganda that's coming out. But it says everything you need to know about the U.S. mainstream media. If we can put that next one on. Now, this is Jonathan Turley. He wrote about this morning on his website. And he points out that a CNN host is very upset about the ruling that we discussed yesterday, which is that the government is bound by the First Amendment, right? They can't go to Twitter and say, hey, you need to silence this guy. And it was a very important court case. Normal people who really do love America, like us, are happy and thrilled because we love the Constitution and we love the Bill of Rights. Well, CNN is a whole different kettle of fish. They think it's a terrible idea. They say that we should yield to government censorship demands. How's that?
Well, I think of this in context of what was going on with COVID, and they really were able to overtake and take over the whole propaganda machine.
The heads up, especially when we talk about COVID, report UN Pact for the Future seeks permanent emergency powers for, quote, complex global shocks. Now, we know what the UN and these international bodies did during COVID. They made life miserable for the rest of the world. And it looks like they're going to have a summit in September, Summit of the Future, where they're going to adopt a pact for the future. It doesn't sound like a good future for the rest of us, though.
Now, here's a hint at what's coming. A global body to lead a, quote, common agenda for all nations during any complex global shocks.
Oh,
and there's a couple coming.
Yeah.
Such as new pandemic.
We'll keep an eye on that. I'm sure you and Chris are probably going to look at some
Yeah, we'll talk about some more. But this whole thing about globalism is sort of a sickening way to handle things. It undermines, it undermines national sovereignty in a true negative way. But it also undermines personal liberty. So if we have a country such as ours had been, more so, where personal liberty, and a lot of people said nice things on the 4th of July about personal liberty, but everybody knows that there's a dissent between two bodies now in this country fighting over the whole issue of even understanding it. It's just the point that we talked about. major newspapers and big companies getting together and say, why are you people upset about the government monitoring? How else are we going to get the truth out to the people? That kind of nonsense. So the bigger the body of individuals running this, the worse it is. And I used to think, I went to a government school, but the government school was one little community. But we had all the teachers, and there was a school board, and there were 20 of us in a class, and I went 8 years through that school. But then when they started putting the groups together, I remember my dad saying, boy, that's getting pretty big. And then it became statewide, and then it became federal, and now it's United Nations. And every time, I think you had to take away from the quality of education and from personal choices and personal liberty. And I think the evidence would show that.
Yeah, absolutely.